interesting that a lot of the ideas that we have here are still being kind of that forward.
Although I feel like it was sort of like this bellwether
Yes.
that it still hasn't.
You
The
think?
things that have been talked about
Yes.
still don't get to the point where we're discussing in 2008.
I'm in the orbit.
Like,
I think that, but I think maybe.
like we've had progress in aspects. Like I think it was a really good.
How about you're a shaper, yeah?
Yeah, I'm a global shaper. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon.
Hello.
Hi, how's it going?
Good.
I'm looking forward to hearing your remarks.
Now, are you a young global leader?
I am a global
Okay. Even better. Braver question.
I like that.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, now we are coming to an end of this journey, and how appropriate to end on a note of looking to the future, of looking at the lessons that we've learned in these past few days, and bringing up the leaders of the future. So shaping transformation, Africa's rising leaders. We have a wonderful panel of young global leaders, global shapers here. And plus, you'll see throughout the program a list of ideas that came out of the new solutions sessions throughout this. In the beginning, we talked about seeing each other with new eyes. And I want to first start with the audience and ask, throughout these few days, how many of you have had a moment of new understanding, a moment of startling insight, and a moment perhaps of seeing Africa's place in the world differently than when you came? So I'm going to ask for a show of hands. How many of you can distinctly remember a moment of startling insight or new understanding? Well, that looks like the majority. Napoleon once said that a leader is a dealer in hope. And I personally believe that the biggest threat to the world today is an epidemic of pessimism. And so tonight we're going to have this session led by people who have chosen hope, have chosen to believe in the future, and who have set the pace for a new generation. I'm going to introduce you not in the order you're sitting, I think, but Tewodros Ashenafi, who's a young global leader and the chairman and CEO of Southwest Energy of Ethiopia. We have Yawa Hansen-Quao, who's the founding director of Leading Ladies Network in Ghana and a global shaper. We have Euvin Naidoo, who's the co-president of the South African Chamber of Commerce, a young global leader and really has focused on entrepreneurs in Africa. Limia Hadira, who's a shaper and the regional program associate of Coxswain Social Investment in Tanzania. Tunisia, that's right. And Juliana Rotich, who's the co-founder and executive director of Ushahidi in Kenya. She's a social entrepreneur and on the Global Agenda Council on Technology. This is going to be an interactive session, and we're going to start with 5 quick questions to learn about what's inside, because you have to lead from the inside out, of our panelists. And I'm going to ask them a series of 5 questions. And when I ask the question, I also want a few people in the audience to jump in with 30-second interventions. And the first I'm going to ask them is how they became a transformational person. What is the one secret to their optimism? And so, who would like to go first?
Happy to.
You start.
I'm actually a participant and perhaps a representative of a leaderless network of people who got together to gather information about the elections in Kenya when we had a contentious election, a network of volunteers and organizations that gathered information during the earthquakes in Haiti and also in Japan and Chile. So really, I wouldn't say I'm a transformational leader. I would say I'm a participant in a transformational movement that's happening online and offline around the world.
And the one secret to being an optimist?
Finding energy in sharing and in working with communities, be it offline or offline. They can really do amazing things that can inspire you to do more.
Euvin, how about for you?
Sure. You know, I grew up in a very small town in South Africa, in KwaZulu-Natal, called Stanger or Kwadeguza. And the hallmark of Stanger is that it's surrounded by sugarcane, green oasis as far as you can see. And this was some 40 years ago in the 70s. And over that period in South Africa, I think the common belief for different communities is that you were born or destined to do something based on how you look. But being surrounded by an amazing group of mentors and examples, ranging from Chief Albert Luthuli and other leaders from that era, I think the point that leaders are created and not born is the mantra that I live by. And that it's the environment and circumstances that shape you, and that anybody can be a leader. And so when I look at our Africa story and Africa journey, when people try to box us with stereotypes and myths, and when you attend international engagements and meet people from other countries that have opinions about the African continent, that belief that we are the creators of our destiny is fundamental to my viewpoint on transformation.
Thank you. Yawa, how about you?
I think I view things a bit more simplistically. I think that I am what you call transformational because of the grace of God. And that grace gets demonstrated through amazing friends and family, well-wishers, people who help me with the vision that I have and support me. I really subscribe to that term. I think it's South African, Ubuntu, that I am because you are because we are. So I think that fundamentally it's grace demonstrated through people.
Thank you. Tewodros?
Yeah, I think the secret to being a transformational leader, at least my secret, is courage. And in courage, I mean courage to have a vision, courage to follow through in the execution, and not giving up when you have obstacles or other negativity in the way. I'll give you one example. 2007, I was flying from the western part of the country to Addis, and unfortunately, the airplane I was on, the engines failed. So there was about 4 minutes as we were coming down. I don't wish that on anybody. So even dealing with that experience took courage, and I think it's the courage that probably had me survive when the others did not.
Thank you. And Lemia, you have lived through quite an experience in Tunisia. They say revolutions aren't determined by what they overthrow, but by how they replace it. How did you become a transformational leader? And give us a sense of what you think is settling out in Tunisia, and if what's being replaced gives you new hope for the future.
I don't know if I would call myself a transformational leader, maybe not yet, but I mean, quite simply, the secret to me is sustainable passion. I mean, if you don't have passion, nothing really drives you to do what you want to do. And in the case of Tunisia and the revolution, I mean, from the point of view of youth, there was certainly passion, and behind that there was also frustration, clearly, I mean, and a need and desire for change. And so I think, I mean, maybe to put these all together, it could not have taken one person to do it. From Yawa's point of view, it would not have happened without courage, It would not have happened without participants, certainly. And I mean, it took everyone coming together for one ruthless leader to be kicked out of the country, and to really, really make a transformation in Tunisia and then consequently in the rest of the region and hopefully the world.
Thank you. We're going to go through another single question. What is the one myth about Africa or your country that you'd like to dispel? And we'll start again with you. Thank you.
The one myth that I'd like to dispel is that Africa is a basket case. It really is not. And perhaps that it's not a continent of builders, that we don't make things, that we're not innovative, because we are, with much less, and we can do much more, even with just a few resources.
And Euvin?
Sure. You know, a lot of the discussion on Africa focuses on our natural resources. But I think the myth to dispel is that the most valuable resource for Africa, it's our human resources. And I think the opinions that people have about this lack or dearth of talent that exists in Africa is certainly a myth. Particularly in my industry, where we work within financial services, you'll often hear, depending on the person, depending on the institution, on a shortage of talent. But I'm constantly amazed in my travels as someone working across Africa in banking, be it Nigeria or Kenya, at the amazing talent that we have within our society. It's a simple formula of taking the time to provide the mentorship and the structure to enable people to come through a system and not making excuses of not recognizing that talent.
And Yawa?
I think for me, the issue that I would like to dispel is the notion that young people are misguided. I think that with what, for instance, the World Economic Forum is doing through the Global Shapers and the other similar efforts across the continent, that young people are really on the front line in terms of moving the continent forward. A really good example that stands in my mind right now was what turned into a 5-hour meeting between members of our Accra hub, where for about 5 hours into the wee hours of this morning, each of us looking at our prospective organizations, thinking about the futures of our communities, planning it together, providing constructive criticism, and helping provide linkages. I think that that's the myth that I'd like to dispel, that young people of Africa are not as misguided as sometimes we're made to believe.
I love hearing about that 5-hour meeting. That's what the Shapers are all about, right? Tewodros, how about for you?
Yes, I think most Ethiopians, at least some of us who spent some time outside of Ethiopia, have had to endure a lot of negativity vis-a-vis the image we've had. And I'm very pleased to say that part of dispelling that image has taken place by this successful World Economic Forum, because you need to bring people to show that actually Ethiopia is not, as my sister said, a basket case. It's not a desert. It's a beautiful country. We have challenges, we have issues, but the myth is already being dispelled. So that's something that I'm extremely pleased about, and this forum has been a big instrument in that process.
Now, after Lemia speaks, I'm going to see if there are any other myths that people in the audience would like to put on the table that need to be dispelled. But Lemia?
They have mentioned many of them, but I'm quite simply going to say that one myth I would like to dispel is that we in North Africa are not Africans, and this is something I will this is something I would like to expand upon later in our discussions, but that is a very important one.
Excellent. How about in the audience? Anyone have a myth that they'd like to put on the table that needs to be dispelled? Right in the back.
The myth I would like to dispel is that we need help from North America and Europe.
And Madam Sizulu?
The myth I'd like to dispel is actually specifically about Nigeria and share a story that I heard recently which made my heart, lifted my heart, that people talk about the terrible congestion, traffic congestion in Nigeria, in Lagos. But somebody told me a story that in that congestion, an entrepreneurial thing has developed where people order their groceries and get runners to do their errands for laundry and stuff like that. And they come back from work in that traffic. They get their meat and their groceries and other things on their way home. So for me, that's entrepreneurial.
Well, you can know the mark of true entrepreneurs who see every problem as an opportunity waiting for a solution. So we certainly see that all over Africa. I've seen that. Yes?
My name is Abi from Nigeria. The myth I would like to dispel is the fact that Africans are the most corrupt people. I just looked at the Transparency International Corruption Index, and I discovered that African nation is not the most corrupt. Thank you.
Congratulations. Very good points. Okay, now I'm going to ask an interesting question that I think reveals a lot about the inspiration that our leaders draw on, and then I'm going to ask a few people in the audience to jump in on this one. I'm going to ask them if they could have dinner with any person throughout human history, living or dead. Who would they most want to have dinner with? And we're going to, again, start here and jump right in.
The one person I'd
Juliana,
love to have dinner with is Carl Sagan, the astrophysicist and educator, because he opened up the world to the wonders of the universe and explained them in such a beautiful way that it made me as a 13-year-old girl to look up at the stars and say, wow, that's what.
Beautiful. I just got goosebumps. Euvin?
Sure. In early 2000, I found myself filling out an application I never dreamed I would fill out. It was an application to attend the Harvard Business School. And I want to share with you the essay that I wrote then, which was exactly the same question. Posed a little different. Who's the most inspirational leader or someone you could have dinner with? And my answer hasn't changed. It's Steve Biko. And why do I pick Biko? Because Biko, at a time when there was great uncertainty, provided clarity about the sense of identity. To be comfortable with who you are and comfortable with the view of expressing a vision and working in a disciplined manner to achieve that. More than that, it was a generation that was deeply involved in civil society and the belief that your integration with society and your leadership by example was key. And I think those lessons resonate very deeply for the world today.
Thank you. Yawa?
This kind of question is always the hardest question for me to answer. I think it's partly because there are so many different things about different people that I admire. But I think for now, I'd say I'd focus on the living, and I would choose Dr. Ngozi-Iweala. I think she's an indomitable spirit. I really think that she's someone who represents a really good model for emerging African women leaders. I think that regardless of the numerous challenges that she has faced, she is simply someone who continues to grow and thrive. And while she's doing it, she's inspiring and pulling people along. So for me, she's someone who really represents, what I think of when I think of who a leading lady is. And she would be who I'd say I'd love to have some more time to get to know.
Thank you. Tewodros?
Yeah, I think I would choose Emperor Lalibela. I would have a nice bottle of Tej, nice injera, and I'll ask him one question. I would say, how did you build those amazing churches?
Thank you. And Juliana?
Again, this is a really difficult one to answer, but I think I too will focus on the living, and I'd say the person I would like to talk to is Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Only because she's an incredible social critic, and she has this creative vision and way of writing about history that gives you a glimpse into the future. And she's written about Nigeria, but I'd love to, read any work that she does about the rest of Africa. She's a visionary, and today we're talking about creativity a lot, so I think an artist is someone we need to look at to solve some of our problems.
And do we have a global shaper or leader in the audience that wants to jump in with a thought on this? The left here? Right here in the front.
For me, I think the one person I'd love to have dinner with would be J.K. Rowling, and I love the Harry Potter books and the Harry Potter series. It's amazing.
Scientists, authors, thinkers, leaders. I asked this question at an MBA program in a remote area of China, and half the students all said the same person. I don't know if any of you could guess who that would be. They said Bill Gates. One of them said, I don't have a garage, but I want to invent something, so I want to build a garage to do so. But very, very thoughtful answers. Thank you. Okay, a couple other quick questions. What is the one change you would like to see if you had one change for this year? We've had a social media campaign. I think we've had over 100,000 people jump in on the social media networks on this, but what's the one change you'd like to see? Juliana, you want to start?
The one change that I'd like to see before 2013 is, actually I'd like to see less potholes. If possible, no potholes at all in my country of Kenya. If that's impossible, I'll settle for a free and fair election in the next.
Someone that can go from the stars to the potholes. It's a woman with vision. Thank you. Euvin?
Sure. The one thing that stands out to me, from the financial industry is that no successful economy has evolved its communities without the transformation of capital markets and finances. And the democratization of access to finance is a really important movement worldwide. To see that really transform, to get people from rural and urban, from all parts of the world, from all income groups to really transact, I'd like to see everybody with a mobile phone. I'd like to see them have an account on that phone. And I'd like to really see this technology spread around the world. And M-Pesa, which started in Africa, has really set the benchmark of what the rest of the world can see as an example. And it's wonderful to see African success stories like that being looked at as the benchmark for other developed economies to see as something to emulate.
Thank you. Yawa?
One change I'd like to see is it's more of a shift in terms of how perhaps we generally perceive women's issues. I think that particularly when we talk about issues affecting African women, they seem to center around vulnerability. So we talk a lot about the high mortality rates for pregnant mothers. We talk a lot about streetism and HIV/AIDS, and undoubtedly these are important issues. But I'm not sure we're giving enough deliberate attention to cultivating leadership. So that is what I'd like to see. I think that I was really encouraged when the African Union declared 2010 to 2020 the decade of the African woman. But again, the issues seem to center around vulnerability. And if we keep saying with our mouths that we need more and more women in leadership, that we want more and more women to get involved in political processes, it means that we have to be deliberate. Women's leadership won't happen in a vacuum. It means that we as civil society, governments, individuals, young people, the youth, all stakeholders need to work together concertedly because women's leadership doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Yawa, could you give us one, just think of your experiences, one moment when you felt you became a leader, where you had to call on those resources inside, and what turned you into someone who was going to be a leader?
I believe I've had numerous kind of times that I've realized potential, but I have a different point of view about it. I think that every woman is a leader, and I think the process we take them to is to reveal to them that potential they already possess. If you can make two kids stop quarreling, I think you can broker world peace in the UN. So I think part of the process is bringing us into a realization that in the day-to-day things that we do, we're already demonstrating leadership at a certain capacity. But it's how do we make it relevant, and how do we scale it at a global level? And how do we ensure that all the relevant stakeholders and parties involved don't feel threatened by it? I do feel that there are a myriad of issues that are in many ways fighting against the efforts of an onslaught of attention towards women's leadership. But I think that each and every one of us, if we look at it that fundamentally, that in your day-to-day, your surviving of your day-to-day survival, managing scarce resources to take care of a family of 5. There are women leading in homes, women leading in all sorts of ways. So I think for me, it helps me to know that day-to-day, in the most minutest of things that I do, I demonstrate leadership.
Thank you. Tewodros?
Yes. I think the theme of the World Economic Forum is that in order to solve a lot of the challenges and the problems that we face in the world, you need the combination of government, business, and civil society working together. And one big change I would love to see is the injection of entrepreneurship in all those 3 things. In government, entrepreneurship in government, obviously in business, and within the civil society, because that leads to taking initiatives, problem solving, and to me, that is one of the biggest ways that we're going to solve the challenges, entrepreneurialism, in all those 3 senses.
But let me ask you, you're an entrepreneur. What do you mean by an injection? You have leaders from Ethiopia here. What does that mean, injecting entrepreneurship into society?
Well, I have to be careful what I say here, but except for the ministers in front of us here, sometimes there are people within government who, let's say, they don't get any benefit for making a decision. Yeah? So at least in business, if you take a risk, there is some type of a reward. And unfortunately, sometimes in government, if you take a decision and if it goes wrong, you get fired. If you make a decision that goes right, everybody will say, well, that's your job. That's what you're supposed to do. So, you understand why sometimes civil servants don't take much risk.
Well, I don't want to shock you, but I think that's a characteristic that's global in governance. Yeah. That in business, things rise and fall on their own weight.
Sure.
And then we don't see that. But one thing that strikes me is the World Bank has a report called Doing Business. And it has the 30 or so levers that need to be in order to have an entrepreneurial economy. And I remember looking at it, in one country it took 80 years of an average person's salary to open a business. You're not going to get an entrepreneurial economy if it costs so much to enter the market. In another country, it took over 30 steps in order to open a business. And a few years ago, Afghanistan became the leading changer because it was a one-step process on the internet to open a business. And so for entrepreneurs, they obviously don't have the resources and capital that they have to put into the bureaucratic problems, but this type of practical leadership, may be one area that can really help start a dialogue on that. Juliana, how about for you? One change?
One change. Today in a digital divide to digital dividend session, someone from Cisco showed a marking visual, and it was all the IP addresses that are in the world, and Europe was just big white heaven of IP addresses, and Africa was somewhat of a big black hole. And so I guess one thing I'd like to see in the next year is to have more IP addresses in Africa. I mean, we know in North Africa, social media was a big driver in organizing, in community organizing for there to be a revolution at the end of the day. So internet is something that's clearly needed for communication throughout the continent.
Now, before I ask them for their one audacious, big, bold idea, and I always go by the theme, don't be afraid to dream, but be afraid not to dream. So we're going to ask them that, but are there questions from the audience for these leaders? Or is there someone who has the one change that they feel they really want to put on the table here? Oh. Sir? We have many leaders here listening. So.
Yes, thank you. My name is Moses Maura. I'm from Kenya. I work with Enablers. I'm very happy to be here. We have a terminology in our country which Kenyans would be familiar with, and maybe people who speak Swahili, and they say, tunaomba serikali. And if you travel around Africa and you watch TV news in West Africa, in Southern Africa, you always find people saying they would like the government to help them. And my big frustration with this is that the average guy in Africa has been so demeaned that he thinks that even clearing garbage from his front yard requires government help. And my one change I would like is, and unfortunately I also had it, I think, at one of the sessions where I think it's one of the panelists 2 days ago talking about, we are going to go out to some place and we want help. And people have been made to believe that they can't do anything for themselves. And 200 years ago, before there were governments in Africa, people were doing stuff, they were solving problems, and they were getting on with their lives. So my one change is I would like to never hear those words again, starting 2013.
Now, I'd like to follow on that for a minute because, Yawa, you mentioned the idea that inspires you, which is the philosophy, I am because you are, which I think in other contexts maybe is called Ubuntu. And I remember reading Nelson Mandela's words on this and Bishop Tutu's words. So the spirit of Ubuntu, which is something that's been so central to the spirit of Africa, is this something still intact? And what does that have to offer to the world? And you seem to feel that that spirit may be a bit unraveling, that community spirit that really has been so strong. I don't know, are there any comments on that? Yes?
I think Ubuntu can be abused. If I'm your relative and you work so hard, and you should be sharing with me.
I think
a more positive view of the, right in the back here?
I don't think Ubuntu would explain what the gentleman was saying. Ubuntu basically says, if you want to succeed, You could never succeed when around you.
Never.
Everyone else is not well. So I am because you are says that I must always take you along with me. I don't think it would be applicable.
Okay, thank you. And I think we had, did we have one right here? Yes. And then I'm going to get back to asking you about the one change. And please introduce yourself.
My name is Tadessa Talahu. I am CEO of National Oil. There is one thing I would like to get changed in the mindset of my Ethiopian colleagues across. And this has been, there is a saying in Amharic, but somebody would help me to translate into English. If I try, I cannot make it. Nabi Bagaru Aikabbarim. And I'm sure people have heard me this. We really want to change our mindset that we need to be appreciative of what we see happening. We have to develop mentality of complementary. And as leaders, I'm very simplistic in my approach. Leaders should have followers. I don't want to be, this is the right thing. There isn't anything right unless we all agree to it. And I want a leader that would develop that kind of approach. And I want also people to appreciate and change our mind that Nabi, meaning
visionary.
The prophet, or a prophet may not be appreciated in his country, but can be appreciated elsewhere. That is the kind of attitude we have to change. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to, I want to stand, as it has been said, in the liberating moment of the future, because that's when we're relieved of restrictions in our mind about what's possible, and to ask about also big, bold, audacious ideas. It was asked earlier this week by someone in the audience, when you're in your dreams, when you're thinking, what is the crazy idea you have that you think wouldn't work, but you think could actually change things? And I'm going to go first to our panelists, and then we'll open it up. And any questions for them, too, you can jump in with the questions. And I'll let you all jump in the order that you want to here. So who'd like to go first?
Happy to begin again.
Good.
The big idea, or when I dream, and what I would really wish for, is to blanket the whole of Africa with broadband. Because right now it costs 10 shillings to call the US or the UK, 18 shillings to call India or China, and 30 to connect to my fellow Africans within Africa from Kenya. That should not be the case. If we had broadband everywhere, I could use Skype and quickly connect.
Thank you, Euvin.
Sure. You know, there's a slide and picture that I think all of us are very familiar with by now, and it's that picture of Africa at night that just has a few speckles of light. And for me, a big, hairy, audacious goal needs to be big, but very much grounded in pragmatism and something that you can see achievable. And that is the electrification and power grids across Africa. Because all the natural resources and the ingredients to make this work exist. And I'd like to talk specifically about the INGA project and some points I mentioned. Because Minister Pravin Gordhan mentioned the INGA project, and that if the elements come together to get and harness hydroelectric power to generate electricity, that electrification of the continent will unlock an entire series of both entrepreneurship. It will enable people to do remarkable things. But what are the barriers to that? And it's very clearly the ability for leaders who are very much elected by their constituents in a country to think beyond our countries and think as regional blocks, to come together particularly around regulation and policy and make sure that policy is able to be forward-looking, instructive, and as a collective team, unlock the resources of the continent. So I think that this is something that's tangible, it can be done, and can be very transformative to the continent.
Let's just take a vote on that idea. Is that an idea that the only block to it really is our imagination and leadership, or is it unachievable? So is that a doable idea?
Yeah.
I may go to our leaders to say, how can this happen? Why isn't it happening? But rural electrification is what transformed American agriculture. I mean, it is true that the power of that idea is phenomenal. Yawa?
For a big, audacious goal, I think for me it would be the whole concept of bringing integrity back to leadership. I think that as a continent, we're seeing a lot of good economic change and transformation. And I think that in addition to that transformation seems to be less of a focus on the integrity of individuals. So let me explain it this way. I read in a book that integrity comes from the root word integer. And integer is a mathematical term that means a whole number. And so leadership and integrity, I think that essentially what we're saying is that we want leaders that are whole. And I see this a lot in the work that Leading Ladies Network is doing when we take in young women and at the high school or university level, and we're trying to engage with them and show them what's possible for their future, what can be different with their career path, and the like. But what we come against is this sense of brokenness, and I use brokenness very advisedly. Many of them tell us very, very traumatic things about what their life experiences have been. A really quick example of that, for instance, is the overwhelming majority of women on our continent whose first sexual experience was through rape or force. From a trusted father, uncle, teacher, and so on. So on the surface of it, you ask yourself, what has this to do with leadership? And I'm finding that over the 3 years we've been attempting to give voice to women in leadership, that it has a lot more than we recognize to do with leadership. How do you engage women who are broken in conversations about helping other people? So I think essentially this is an issue that has multiple layers, and I understand, and I think that's what makes it audacious. But bringing integrity, the concept of wholeness as individuals, the healing that I think needs to happen among so many young people on our continent, if we want the future of our continent to look secure, I think that we do need to give some thought to the emotional, the psychological state of health. Because one of the things that is leading to, for instance, in the quickly westernizing, quickly transforming, quickly economically viable arena of Ghana, for instance, is that you have lots of women who are in the work system, who are attaining positions and who are experiencing success in careers and have this sense of brokenness, immense brokenness. And sometimes it's demonstrated in the exploitation of their own sexuality. So exchanging their bodies for favors in order to advance. And there's a warped kind of mindset that brings along with it. I don't think anyone really talks about that. And so if there was one audacious goal that I would have, it would be simply to bring the concept of integrity or wholeness back to the arena of leadership.
And sometimes the beginning of transformation is talking about things that we've been afraid to talk about, so thank you. Before I go to Tewodros, I'm just going to jump into the audience. Who has a big, audacious goal? Right here.
So I have a dream, I have a big dream, that one day in my lifetime, Africans will have access to the capital they need. Because we have less fortunate, vulnerable people in Africa that are ambitious and entrepreneurship and can make a difference, but don't have the means to access the capital. And it's a shame today that Prime Minister Gordon Brown said to us that we have 2% of the global capital in Africa as FDI. I believe the only sustainable change that we can see in Africa, and these ideas are bold and beautiful that we've heard, but without capital, they're useless and can't be implemented. So my dream is that poverty can be alleviated and jobs can be created by more FDI. And I hope that our leaders of Africa, both in the private and public sector, can come together and lobby the rest of the world to drive our FDI from 2% to 10% in the next decade. Thank you.
I'm going to go back to the waving hands there, but I'm going to take another poll. Let's just take it now. Let's be really audacious.
Okay.
What if all the aid in the world was put into a social entrepreneur fund and the bottom billion of the world could each get $1,000 to start a business? How many of you think something like that? Just to take this access to capital, like we need a sea change in the ability of people to start small businesses and change their lives. Let's get a show of hands. So I want to talk about a little bit just how do we make that kind of dream real. But in the back, we have three very excited people.
Hello. Okay.
And one here in the blue shirt. Okay.
Okay, my name is Simi Fajumiroko, and I'm a shaper from Abuja, Nigeria. And my audacious dream is to see the image problem in Africa turned over and changed by 2015, where the African child is not pathetic, is not poor, and does not need handout, but is confident enough to drive transformation from the rural areas up. See, what the WEF provides for us is as a platform for idealism from this level, but we also need to share our success stories and create our African heroes that inspire the African child to innovate and to transform. Thank you.
I love that. The World Economic Forum, a platform for idealism. And I hope that all of us who have somehow let our dreams shrink down are really being infused with the vision of the young shapers and young global leaders here.
I would assert that we do have the wealth and we do have the capital, and I'd assert that that's really under my feet. Hernando de Soto talks about private property and talks about the wealth creation of private property. We've talked about really big projects for the last 2 days. We've talked about infrastructure. We've talked about really transforming at a very, very big level. What we haven't talked about is the granular way that we can make a very big difference in every single person's life, in every family in Africa, and that's by giving people access to owning title on their land. And that's really a very small, not uncomplicated process, but if we could just do that, then people have something to use as collateral. They can go out and get and empower themselves to the point that was made earlier today. So I have a small, audacious goal. Give people property rights.
Tewodros, we'll go back to you.
Yeah. Given that I'm in the resources business, some people might be surprised by this audacious goal. The future will be predicated, I think, in three interesting areas. One is brain research. The second is nanotechnology. And the third is biotechnology. So I would love for Africa to be the source of the innovation in these three things. I would love for us to be able to manufacture parts for the body, kidneys, organs, and so on and so forth, biotechnology, which is on the way. And imagine that this comes out of Africa. Wouldn't that blow everybody's mind?
And Juliana? Juliana first.
Lemia.
Lamia, I'm sorry.
So to be here today in Addis, I live in Tunis, and I had to go through Istanbul. When I go to Lagos, I have to go through Rome or Paris. So my big dream for Africa is to have an aviation agreement whereby we can fly throughout Africa at low cost with the imposition of limited carbon footprint.
And throughout this week, we've certainly heard about open borders, the need for visa exchange, for common standards in trade, in food, in access with transportation. A great vision. A few more I'd like, if we can, to get in 5 30-second big audacious goals. So we'll start right here.
I have a big dream. Africa has got problems of foreign direct investment, 2% coming into Africa. Can you imagine what will happen to Africa if all the money that has been externalized through theft and corruption and sitting in Western banks is returned back to Africa? We would not need foreign direct investment.
And we have one in the back there, and then we'll go to you.
My name is Jamal Grib. I have a dream which is not very costly. It's just if one day we can travel from Algiers to Cape Town, Djibouti to Dakar, without borders, without visa. Just, that's all.
Thank you. And to the woman here.
Hello, my name is Deborah Hinkra, and I'm a global shaper from the Accra Hub. My big, hairy dream is to have a future where young people in Africa can see themselves represented in the content that they consume. I grew up in Ghana, and I watched cartoons, but I never watched any cartoon from Ghana or anywhere in Africa. I read books. I never read about Ghana. I never read about Africa. Children in the future must read about themselves on this continent. We no longer have any excuse why this is not the case.
Thank you. And just two more, one right here.
Hello, I am Jihad Abu Nafisa, global shaper from Khartoum. Hi again. My audacious dream is to have the elementary and secondary school curricula in all African education systems to have peace education and not to have our students go to school in uniforms that resemble military fatigues like we have in Sudan. So we need peace education in our curriculum so that young people are not easily fooled that war is the best solution.
Hello. Hello.
Yes.
Suresh Chaturvedi from OIA Addis. If I have been made leader, I'll request Discovery Channel to stop showing only animal in Africa. There's other things also which they should show in Africa because it gives us a big problem for all of us who come for the business. Last 10 years I am coming here. When I was coming last in 2004 to Addis, I had 6 baggage with me. I asked my wife why it is. She said, you didn't see on TV how much hunger is there in Ethiopia and all these things, so I've kept your food for 10 days. So just my request is to change that image of Africa and start showing other things. 1992, I was in Houston and I was sitting in a petrochemical conference. One American gentleman asked me, do you have elephant there? I said, yes, in India. He said, how you go to office? I said, on one elephant I go, and on another elephant I come back. So please stop showing that image, and because Africa is growing with speed. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank everyone. We've run out of time. I especially want to thank our young global leaders and young global shapers. And I'd like to all... And I'd like to have you all join in with me in thanking Professor Schwab for bringing into the World Economic Forum these new voices. And not only that, deciding that the best note to end these conferences on is hearing from the voices of the future. And I, for one, leave deeply inspired with knowing that the dreams are bigger than we've been able to contain, and knowing that we as leaders all have to step up to keep up with the dreams of a new generation. I thank you all very much, and please, thank you. Let's applaud each other for a wonderful session. I now want to welcome the Minister of Finance of South Africa, Pravin Gordhan, who has an announcement to make.
Good evening to all of you. At their age, I was an activist that tried to destroy the system of apartheid. And I can tell you, this is the most inspiring session I've been at for a long, long time. So firstly, let me congratulate our panelists here for reintroducing the word idealism, because idealism is what the world needs at the moment, certainly if you want to talk about the word transformation. No transformation can happen if we don't have a sense of where we want to take the transformation, and what are the ideals that we want to aim for, and how do we reintroduce basic human values like the concept of Ubuntu, back into the discourse, whether it's politics, economics, or social. Let me also thank and congratulate the Ethiopian government and people for their wonderful hospitality. I'm sure all of you would agree with that and join me in thanking them. I think we can pronounce today also that the future of Africa is in very safe hands, if these are the hands that we have. There's one disappointment, and I suppose that reflects the generation gap, which I didn't want to admit to. And I'm sure most of the people at my age don't want to admit to it either. So if you ask my generation, who would you like to have dinner with? So that would be Che Guevara, Nelson Mandela, or Mahatma Gandhi. Now, I'm very disappointed that none of you mentioned any of them. But I think when we talk about Africa's transformation, it's also important to remember that while we talk about business, social entrepreneurs, politics, society, and economics, at the end of the day, it's the billion lives on this continent that you really want to transform. Because it's those billion lives that should be the beneficiaries of any transformation process, whilst of course those who've invested in this process benefit as well. And so I hope that WEF will again help us direct our eyes and minds to how do the billion benefit, and how do we not go about recreating the 1% society, because that 1% society is certainly not a sustainable society. Next year on May 8th, 9th, and 10th, you will be welcome to Cape Town, which will host the next WEF, Africa. And Cape Town, as many of you know, lies at the doorstep of Robben Island, which is where the Mandelas, Sisulus, and Katraras made sure that their idealism didn't die and their passion for change didn't disappear, notwithstanding 27 years on Robben Island. And perhaps that's what should inspire both ourselves and this generation in front of us to continue that change process. We are an 18-year-old democracy, and when you look at democracies elsewhere in the world that are thousands of years old, if not hundreds of years old, we've done pretty well as South Africa, and of course we'll be the first to admit that we have much more to do to undertake some of the changes that will meaningfully change the lives of our people. But those dates, the 8th, 9th, and 10th of May, are very interesting in South African history. It will be the 4th anniversary of the current administration, which is the 4th democratic government in South Africa only. So you'll join us in celebrating that occasion. I think we've been reminded by many that in the transformation process, and I think our convener here mentioned that, one of the things that we need to do is to admit the reality for what it is. If we deny the reality of poverty, the reality of inequality, the reality of many of us struggling to meet the Millennium Development Goals, then we can't have an appreciation of what the level of tasks that we have confronting us. And transformation, as many of you would know, are people-driven processes, not individual-driven processes. Leaders are extremely important, but so are selfless activists. If activists are only looking for their own benefit out of any transformation process, invariably it's the few that cream off the benefits of change and the many remain on the margin. But equally, as all of our young people have pointed out, you require bold and visionary leaders who help to shape the transformation process and the transformation vision. But transformation doesn't come easy. It requires, as has been pointed out, relentless passion. It requires optimism and belief in oneself, and it requires both patience and urgency at the same time. It sounds like a contradiction, but change doesn't happen overnight all the time. That requires patience. But if you have too much of patience and not enough urgency, it will take far too long. And that's the balance that we need to get right. So I hope that these are some of the issues that we will discuss in Cape Town, continue the conversation around shaping Africa's transformation, talk a lot more about how do we build genuine partnerships between government, civil society, and business, talk a lot more about what are the new models that Africa could create. And many of you today and this evening have talked about Africa generating new ideas and new models that shape not only Africa's transformation, but global transformation as well. And so one of the challenges that we face together is how do we find a model, if you like economic, political, and social, which says, yes, let's get high growth at 6 or 7%. Let's make sure that we create jobs for young people in particular, but millions of other people as well. How do we reduce inequality through the growth process? And above all, as we move towards Rio +20, how do we incorporate sustainable development within this vision as well? So I'm sure that you'll generate ideas over the next year or so and share them with us in South Africa. Thank you very much.
Now, as a further demonstration that the World Economic Forum really enacts what it believes, I want you to welcome a former young global leader who you've gotten to know well, who will close the conference. But please join me in really thanking Elsie Kanza, our Director for Africa.
Thank you very much, Josette. Slight correction, I'm still a young global leader and have been teasing my fellow young global leaders as to why I haven't heard their voices over the last 2 days. The global shapers have truly outshone us and inspired us to do more, I think, to be better leaders and to be more candid and open. I think we've had enough speeches and had a very inspiring closing plenary and inspiring short statements by the Minister Pravin Gordhan. I'd like to thank you very much for your active participation and would like to welcome you in a round of applause for the Ethiopian government as well as for all the participants. Thank you. And on that note, I wish to declare the 22nd World Economic Forum on Africa officially closed. Safe travels and welcome to the reception outside.